international realities as he had hoped it would be. His group of experts would read the foreign press, analyze issues, and write long reports. But in general, the policies that were implemented were formulaic and slavishly following the Soviet line on a variety of issues, one of which is Yugoslavia, just to depart from India. Premier Zhou directly asked Chen only twice for advice. Both of these times were in 1951 in relation to the Korean War and what were U.S.-American intentions about concluding the war. Chen Hansheng's contact with Premier Zhou otherwise was through Chang Han-fu, who, in Chen's words, was, quote, a good man, but too timid and limited in terms of his knowledge of international affairs. According to Chen, the foreign ministry often consulted the Soviet embassy for insights about India, for maps, for example. Interestingly enough, I think I'll have to ask all of you, but about the same time, Nehru was consulting the Soviet embassy about China. Somebody should pursue that line. Both of them asking the Moscow how to understand the other is interesting. Finally, considering Chen's unique deep background and contacts in India, including at the very top, like Nehru and Christian Menon, Chen Hansheng especially regretted that he was never asked directly for advice in reference to the handling of the deteriorating India-China relations over border issues during the late 1950s. Clearly, domestic politics and the anti-rightist movement of 1957 were a major reason why Chen Hansheng and other internationalists like Ji Jiaoding were completely ignored by the late 1950s. Chen's last foreign trip was in 1958. Chen himself was not purged and sent to the countryside, but like a number of his associates. The Nanya Zoo, however, was dismantled. From this point on, Chen played it safe. His preoccupation became scholarship, publishing in Chinese a variety of ecological, and read the book I've talked about with Daniel Thorner, but also historical work on the Mughal period. And I have a bibliography here of his works in Chinese, mostly about India. He also founded the South Asia Institute, the Nanya Yenjoso, at Beijing University, the first of its kind in China. He promoted the work on contemporary India as well as scholarship of an earlier period, the famous German-trained Sanskritist and later Beijing University Vice President Ji Xianlin. They were both, remember, educated in Germany. Needless to say, Chen's contacts in Delhi might have been useful in the late 50s when relations between India and China were deteriorating so badly. The fumbling by both sides of negotiations over the border issues led to, as you know, greater misunderstanding and nationalist posturing. And this was just as China was becoming more isolated internationally because of the Sino-Soviet split. The result, of course, is the tragic war of 1962, that in retrospect accomplished little besides militarizing the border, and from a Chinese point of view, further isolating China. A prelude, in a sense, to the xenophobia of the Cultural Revolution. Let me turn now, much more briefly, and as I say, insecurely, to make a few observations about the Indian side. Okay. The young diplomat with some Chinese language ability mentioned at the outset was Vaisam Pranchbai, who was sent by the Indian Foreign Ministry to study at Beida between 47 and 1950. He graduated in 1950. His Chinese name is Bai Junhui. And for 10 years he served as the chief translator, as you probably know, in the relationship of the 1950s. He too thought, and I interviewed him, he died in Pune, and I interviewed him at the end of his life a couple of times. Again, I'll skip here a little bit. Basically, he confirmed the views articulated above by Chen Hansheng, that also they thought that K.M. Panikkar was not the greatest choice on the Indian side as an ambassador. He had been the ambassador of the Kuomintang government. He was basically anti-communist, too pro-American, a crony of Nehru's, admittedly, but still was not the greatest choice, you know, on that side. Pranchbai thought both sides, India and China, were diplomatically incompetent in a lot of ways, especially over the border issues, and this is pretty well known. They met a number of times. They both bemoaned the lack of background about China or India by decision makers, or the attention paid to existing expertise. Branchpai met Professor Chen a number of times back and forth. Okay, finally, Kasambi, who was a mathematician, but then became a scholar of early Indian history. In fact, his book on early Indian history was one of the first books by an Indian published in translation in Chinese in the 1980s. He went to China a lot in the World Peace Movement and so on in the 1950s, and was a socialist, not a communist. He met Chen Hansheng and so forth. He was critical of Nehru's foreign policy and was certainly not part of official delegations. His last trip was in 1960, actually at the time of the Great Famine, and China didn't meet much of anybody except a few of the foreigners working in China, like Israel Epstein. He wrote, though, and I cite some of them here, some of his articles that were very pro-China, the Chinese road to socialism and so forth. Okay, let me just conclude that I think these are important stories, and it does unfortunately seem that in the long run, Chen Hansheng's activities had a limited impact, and they maybe underline the larger failure of the decades of the 1950s. And so I raise a couple of questions here at the end. Why had the intellectual scholarly worlds of India and China become so badly disconnected by the mid-20th century? There is, of course, the whole Tagore, Shanti Niketin and the tours of Chinese intellectuals like Xu Zhimo, Yang Suming, Dai Ji Tao, Xie Beihong, and so on, that relationship. But this was one positive side of the Chinese to India connection. But then there's the more negative stream, which is on the Chinese left. And one could talk about that from Chen Duxiu, the founder of the Chinese Communist Party, one of them, were dismissed the usefulness of the India-China connection. And you see this with Chinese journalist reports about India in the 1940s and so on. I think caught in the middle between these two poles of interest in pursuing close ties with India and China were figures like Chen Hansheng. He seems to have been, and I may be wrong, I hope I am, a relatively rare exception, attracted in the 40s to India and scholar activists like Rango, but because of the plight of the Indian and Chinese peasant scene, both of them as ripe for revolution. And later in the 50s, you saw the importance geopolitically of the India-China connection as a counter to both the Soviets and the US, as well as their common interest in economic development. Maybe Chen Hansheng was just 60 years ahead of his time. I don't know. The Indian side, there is some polarization as well, it seems to me. There was the anti-colonial framework of mutual understanding in the 1940s, and that seems to go sour as time goes on. Ranga is sort of representing that in my mind. Knowledgeable figures like Vaisa Branchpai and Chen Hansheng seem to be tragically caught in the middle on both sides. Both of them trying to bring balance and more knowledge to the dialogue, but not somehow getting through enough. I'd like to show you briefly some slides, and I'm sorry, I've run over, haven't I? I'll just skip here. Okay, this is Chen Hansheng on the right. This is actually in the U.S. in 1946, right after he left India. I don't seem to have a good picture of him in India that I own, at least on the slide. That's Agnes Smedley. And this is Yangon, no, that's Yangon, who is a well-known Chinese journalist at the time. The other lady, I'm afraid I can't tell you who she is. This is the diary that's in the Beida. They allowed me for a little while to take pictures of the diary, and then they said, no more. So I have a sort of fragment of it. But it's up in the archives, and somebody should really go through this, it seems to me, and write a dissertation about it. But you can see it's a mixture, well, here, I think I have another one too. There's a little bit of English, but mostly Chinese, of course. And this is his handwriting. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I wish we had more time. There's so much really to learn from your presentation. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry.
I carried an atlas, which was a companion volume for the ecological and economic study of South Asia in 1987 from Alice Turner, and gave it to Chen Hansheng in 1987. Well, so many of these stories come back to me. Thank you very much. And the intellectual history that we are now probing through our researchers, several of them are present here, will really feel indebted to you for this presentation. Thank you very much. We will come back to it during the discussion hour, because you have so arranged that we have first the presentations and then the discussion. Next is Ambassador Kishan Rana, our colleague, honorary fellow of the Institute, a very senior diplomat and also a diplomacy scholar of global reputation. He has a number of very important books, several of them translated into Chinese, and we are very privileged to have him as our colleague and co-founder of this whole effort of ICS. So I have great pleasure in inviting Kishan Rana, who is presenting a paper on Chiang Kai-shek and pre-independence India-China conversations. Kishan.
Thank you very much. This little paper of mine was put together while I was sitting on a hilltop in Mount Abu, and totally isolated from any literature or material, but Alka bullied me into writing this or presenting this. So I offer my, what shall I say, apologies in advance for its limitations. The Indian independence movement had perhaps an unusual characteristic in its events that took place in the late 30s was Jawaharlal Nehru's 13-day visit to China. It seems he flew to Kunming and went on to Chongqing, and some very exuberant accounts have been written of his visit to Kunming and the impact that he seems to have made. And I'm going only by stuff that I dug up on the internet yesterday. Included in that internet search is an article that appeared in the Hindu in November 2012, which talks of an effort by Churchill. You may remember that India sent out the colonial government of India, British India, sent out agents general to China and to the United States. And of course in the UK there was the India office, a huge establishment that goes back to the 20s. Anyway, Jawaharlal Nehru was to visit Yan'an and meet Mao. And he was called back to India because war broke out just at that time. This is, I think, for me at least, one of the great what-ifs of India-China relationships, of how enormously different the relationship might have been if Nehru had seen firsthand, met Mao and seen firsthand what the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, was all about. But that was not to be. The only person he met, a person who then became an important figure, was Marshal Ye Jianying in Chongqing. Apparently the Marshal was on the liaison person, perhaps, at the KMT government headquarters. Nehru was not much impressed by Chiang Kai-shek. Apparently he mentions this in his book, in Nehru's book, China, Spain and the World, and the War. Again, it's a book that I have not seen, so I speak from great deal of ignorance. Chiang Kai-shek took an interest in India. The why and the wherefore, again, I'm not sure about. It seems that this was partly at the behest of President Roosevelt. One must remember that President Roosevelt was very much interested in India. That's, of course, part of another great big story, and there is a collection of the Nehru, the Roosevelt-Churchill correspondence in 3 volumes that bears testimony to all the things that Roosevelt said and did vis-a-vis India, and of course the writings of Harry Hopkins, who was Roosevelt's personal emissary to the court, shall we say, of Winston Churchill, and sat in the war rooms at some very interesting moments, and others who were involved with the UK-US relationship. It seems that Chiang Kai-shek saw India as an important wartime ally, and in early 42, immediately after Pearl Harbor, when Japan was rampant throughout Southeast Asia, and there was a great deal of anxiety as to how far Japan would go. There was talk that Japan would come and occupy Kolkata and Madras, for example. Chiang sent a message to Winston Churchill in January 42 that he wanted to visit India. And Churchill agonized over this because he saw this as an unwarranted intrusion into Britain's chasse gardée. In a message that Churchill sent to the Viceroy in New Delhi on the 3rd February, he showed an understanding of the potential consequences of India and China coming together. And he instructed the Viceroy, and I quote, "No circumstances should Chiang be allowed to see Nehru as you apprehend." I imagine that Panditji was that time a prisoner. And I think that is why he felt that he had this control over him. And Churchill added, there would be no possibility of such a meeting remaining secret, and nothing would be more likely to spread the pan-Asian malaise through all the bazaars of India. This is typical Churchill language. I will skip over a little reference to the FDR, the Roosevelt role vis-a-vis Churchill, but one should, anyone interested in that correspondence, should really consider the correspondence and the personal exchanges of Roosevelt and Churchill going back to August 41. I think that was the first time that Churchill met Roosevelt, although there is a story that they probably also met in 1918, but nobody really remembers that very well. But Roosevelt kept pressing Churchill on India for a number of reasons, one of which was that in those days before Pearl Harbor, when Roosevelt faced opposition in the United States vis-a-vis his policy, his Lend-Lease and everything else, he did not want to appear to be supporting a Britain that was seeking essentially to safeguard its colonial heritage. And I think with that was also the element that the US resented the Commonwealth preferences, the colonial preferences, which undercut American commercial interests. Be as it may, when the visit could not be blocked, Churchill decided it would only take place under the sponsorship of the Viceroy, who would oversee all arrangements, including meetings with Indian leaders. And that was the tenor of Churchill's letter to Chiang Kai-shek, where he threatened virtually, 3rd February 42, where he threatened that anything other than that would create, quote, the most grievous impression that Great Britain and throughout the British Empire, it would create an adverse impression. And then Churchill dug out his old tactic of quasi-bogus figures of the population of India and the importance of the Muslim population in India. All this goes back to Winston Churchill's early days in India. And Churchill was a member of, Churchill was in the 4th Hussars, which was a British regiment in India. There is a distinction between the British Army and the British Indian Army. And Churchill was in the British Army. His only direct contact with the British Indian Army, by chance, after his adventures on the northeast frontier in 1897, was that he spent several weeks with the Punjab regiment, which was a Muslim regiment. And he came away with profound impression of the martial qualities of the Muslim soldier, the Muslim Indian soldier, and the impact it's left on his mind. But that's another long and complicated story. On the 6th February, Churchill sent a message to the Viceroy where he said, Chiang has proposed himself and will be an honored guest, but he has no right to intervene between the government of the King Emperor and any of the King's subjects. It would be disastrous if you put yourself in the position where we had Gandhi and Nehru on one side and the Viceroy on the other, with Chiang Kai-shek arbitrating between the two. Further message to Chiang Kai-shek this time, Churchill advised him against meeting Gandhi on the ground that this would impede the desire we have for rallying India in the war effort against Japan. It might well have the unintended effort of emphasizing communal differences at a time when unity is imperative. And he urged Chiang Kai-shek not to press the matter contrary to the wishes of the Viceroy of the King Emperor. Nevertheless, a meeting took place, but it took place in a manner where, in a sense, Chiang Kai-shek succumbed to the pressures that had been exerted on him. Chiang Kai-shek sent a message to Churchill on the 13th February 42 via the Viceroy, saying, since my arrival in Delhi, I have decided to modify my itinerary and give up the intention of visiting Wardha. Please be assured that my personal movement is of small concern to me when interests of our joint war efforts are involved. Nevertheless, Chiang Kai-shek did meet Gandhiji, evidently in Kolkata. And what was the Indian impression of that meeting? We don't know too much about it, except that Gandhiji wrote to Vallabhbhai Patel that Chiang Kai-shek came and went, quote, without creating any impression. All he had to say was this: be as it may, help the British. They are better than the others, and they will now become still better. Obviously, there are no KMT archives that are available, and I was checking with my good friend Ambassador Ranjit Gupta. There is some material on this? Good, we'll come to that in a moment. Thank you, sir. But be as it may, Indian leaders were not much impressed by Chiang Kai-shek. Leo Amery, who was Secretary of State for India, writes in his diary in 30th July 42, long and woolly telegram from Chiang Kai-shek to Roosevelt urging the latter to intervene in India. Chiang Kai-shek's ignorance of India seems abysmal, but I am inclined to read in the telegram the hand of Madame, meaning Madame Chiang Kai-shek, Sun Ching-ling, who is very much taken up with Nehru. And he again adds a few days later, not much news from the office except Chiang Kai-shek's impertinence in sending messages of sympathy to Gandhi Nehru, which Linlithgow very lightly refused to deliver. On the 9th August, and I am really coming to the end of my little tale, Roosevelt sent a message to Churchill, which he had received from Chiang Kai-shek. in which Chiang Kai-shek expressed concern over the arrest of the Congress Working Committee, including Gandhi and Nehru, and expressed the dread, this is Chiang Kai-shek's dread, that such a development would prove a great setback to the Allied cause in the Far East and would certainly have a disastrous effect on the entire war situation. Roosevelt, somewhat mischievously, sent this message to Churchill saying, "What do you think?" And Churchill, who was, shall we say, no blushing rose when it came to expressing himself on India, with great feeling, extraordinary feeling, I would even say. He sent a reply to Roosevelt on the 13th August 1942, in which he took the high road of injured outrage. "I take it amiss that Chiang should make difficulties between us and should interfere in matters about which he has proved himself most ill-informed, which affect our sovereign rights. Decision to intern Gandhi was taken by the executive of 12, at which only one European was present. These Indians are as good patriots and able men as any Congress leaders. They have shown great courage, and it is essential not to weaken their authority. All Chiang's talk about Congress leaders wishing us to quit in order that they may help allies is eyewash. They are concerned with one thing only, namely Congress supremacy. It occurred to me that you could remind Chiang that Gandhi was prepared to negotiate with Japan on the basis of a free passage for Japanese troops through India in the hopes of their joining hands with Hitler. Personally, I have no doubt that in addition, there would have been an understanding that the Congress would have sufficient Japanese troops to take down the composite majority of 90 million Muslims, 40 million untouchables, and 90 million in the princely states, etc. And then, finally, Churchill sent an elaborate reply to Chiang Kai-shek, which is quite interesting. "I do not consider that the Congress in any way represents India, which is a continent, includes some of the former 95 and 45, but Churchill is not bothered about such little details, none of whom are represented by the Congress, which is almost entirely a Hindu organization. If these large majorities are added together, they comprise a substantial majority of all the people of India. Moreover, the Congress has nothing in common with the fighting races of India, of whom over 1 million have volunteered for the army, including the present war," etc. And he goes on. I really don't have to repeat all of this, but I would end by saying, it has occurred to me that Your Excellency might be willing to reflect a little bit on some of these points. I think the best tool for the Allies to follow is not to interfere in each other's internal affairs. We have abstained from even the slightest comment when communist-Comintern differences were most acute. I should therefore greatly regret if Your Excellency were drawn into the political correspondence with the Congress. I am afraid this would lead to the estrangement of Your Excellency of a powerful section of British opinion. With regard to the suggestion that Britain should accept the mediation of the President of the US regarding their relationship with the Indian Congress in general, and generally with India, I should place on record that no British government of which I am the head or a member will ever be prepared to accept such a mediation on a matter affecting the sovereign rights of His Majesty King Emperor. This was really the last time that we know that Chiang Kai-shek tried to interfere with or deal with Indian affairs. I should end at this. But I do want to add a word about Vasant Paranjpe that you mentioned, sir, if I may, take just a minute. Vasant Paranjpe was not only just a person who spoke Chinese. Vasant Paranjpe was one of the finest Chinese language speakers and interpreters in the world at that particular time. And it's a great pity. He knew Vasant Paranjpe very well. I worked with him in Hong Kong, and I worked directly under him for a year. It was a somewhat turbulent time for me because we really didn't get along terribly well. Vasant Paranjpe was, after 62, a person who was greatly embittered vis-a-vis China. And this comes out in his writing. but he had a store of personal knowledge that was incomparable. And it's a great pity that Manoranjan has not left behind any major record of his own personal impressions. He was the only Indian present when Panditji and Zhou Enlai met in New Delhi in March of 1960. Those 7 meetings that took place at the Prime Minister's residence, he was the interpreter on the Indian side, and it's a pity that we do not have access to all that he knew and about which he could speak with great authority. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pity that Rana Mitter.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that Rana didn't give me a paper as such, so really the few words of his that I have to read are more echoing the kind of words of Professor Mohanty and of Alka earlier, and really demonstrating his hopes for this collaboration in the future. So he writes, "I'm delighted that we have been able to bring together this meeting between the Institute for Chinese Studies Delhi and the British University China Centre. I am just as disappointed that I cannot be here for the meeting. A short time ago, my father-in-law became extremely ill, and while we have good hopes of his recovery, I did have to make the decision at short notice to stay with him and my family to sort out his continuing care.